Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is the quintessential summer video game of 2021. It seems like each year in recent memory, we've gotten a PlayStation game that just begs you to go after the Platinum Trophy. I'm talking about games like Horizon Zero Dawn, Insomniac's Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima, and others of this ilk that just find that perfect harmony. These games have exhilarating gameplay and gorgeous visuals, but aren't weighed down too often by difficulty, complex controls, or bad story pacing. And funny enough, 2016's Ratchet and Clank remake fits this description as well. And now, 5 years later, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart fills that role. Insomniac's latest entry in the franchise punches through the myriad of other PlayStation 5 games that we've gotten so far, as it looks and feels like the first truly next-generation title. Even on my TV that only supports 1080p, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart looks immaculate, but I can't even fathom how good the game would look on a new 4K TV. It's also the first major title to really take advantage of the DualSense controller and use it to add more to the experience. Outside of this notable step up in graphical fidelity, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is a pretty standard affair for the series, save for the inclusion of a new Lombax, Rivet, that you can play as. You'll venture across planets, completing main story missions, as well as optional objectives and hunts for collectibles, all while blasting away enemies new and old. The story is your standard save the world affair, but given the inclusion of multiple dimensions, it becomes more of a save the world's affair. It's about what you'd expect from a Ratchet and Clank game. It's a super fun, action-packed romp that's filled with memorable characters, wacky weaponry, and tons of charm. The game does have some issues that I'll address over the course of this review, but many of them are easy to overlook and won't bother many folks. This is doubly true given how Insomniac handled the development of this title by ensuring that no employee would have to undergo periods of crunch to get the game done on time. These sorts of stories are so far and few between that it's important to acknowledge when they happen and support the studios making these efforts to avoid crunch. So if you're just looking for a recommendation, I can say go out and buy this game. You will not regret it. Whether you've played every game in the franchise or are a complete newcomer, there's something special here to enjoy. I wouldn't call it a system seller, but it's for sure a must-play if you own a PlayStation 5. For everyone else, there will be spoilers ahead, so welcome to my review of Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. So, I first played a Ratchet and Clank game in 2013 when I was a sophomore in college. I played through and enjoyed the first 3 titles. They were all great games, and I say that as someone who played them all back to back to back. I've also dabbled in 1 or 2 of the other titles, but really nothing significant. I'm sharing this so you know that this review comes from a Ratchet and Clank novice. I'm not a mega fan, but what I can say is that much of the gameplay here aligns with that of the original titles. Most of your time will be spent in third-person shooting, but there are smaller activities to break things up a bit, some of which are better than others. The key difference between this title and the originals is that collectibles and optional activities aren't really gated off behind walls that require certain items to bypass. This Metroidvania element of the originals isn't found in Rift Apart, but I can't say that I personally miss it. In those games, it never felt good to leave a planet unfinished, and returning to it simply to find the last few collectibles never felt as good as the first time through. Anyway, the gameplay in Rift Apart can be broken up into 3 categories: combat, short downtime activities, and collectible hunting. When reviewing games, I always play on the normal difficulty, as it's safe to assume that that's the intended experience. In the case of Rift Apart, the normal difficulty is simply too easy, and it left me wishing that the combat encounters contained more enemies to fight. Fights seemed to end too quickly, which made me feel like the downtime activities like the Clank puzzles, the Speedo rides, and the glitch missions were popping up more frequently than they actually were. So that's a brief overall assessment of the gameplay, but now let's take a deep dive into these three categories to see how they succeed and fail. As you'd expect, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is a third-person shooter with platforming, puzzles, and exploration thrown in for good measure. Despite what I just said a moment ago, you'll find yourself in combat a majority of the time in Rift Apart. My issue was that it just didn't feel like that majority was big enough. I'll clarify this now as well. Ratchet and Rivet both control identically, so if I use one of their names, just know it's also true for their counterparts. When moving around combat arenas, Ratchet's natural movement controls feel like a very fluid strafing mechanic, which greatly helps in positioning yourself to avoid incoming enemy attacks, while also setting yourself up in position to get some hits of your own. This sense of control is further enhanced by the jump and dash abilities that create more opportunities for last-second dodges. The dash does feel a little slow though, but it still functions as intended. This responsiveness in movement was vital in this game, given how many enemies, bullets, particle effects, and other environmental objects can appear on your screen at once. It never feels like clutter, but it does mean that the controls needed to be airtight, so that players didn't feel like they were taking damage because they couldn't see it coming in a screen full of stuff. The level design in Rift Apart is also superb. There's 9 planets to explore, and each of them feels expansive and chock full of secrets, collectibles, and Easter eggs. Each planet has its own theme, but many of them contain amazing set pieces, like the pirate ship escape on Ardolus, or interesting ideas executed very well, like the shifting between the normal and ruined dimensions of Blizzard Prime. But more on that later. For now, I want to focus on the level design of combat arenas, because it's quite good. There's plenty of smartly crafted environments to fight in. You of course have your standard room of enemies, but many areas contain moving parts, obstacles to navigate such as pitfalls, and multiple layers adding to the verticality. There's also the inclusion of rifts that act like instantaneous grapple hooks. When in range, Rivet can latch onto a rift, teleporting her across the arena in order to flank enemies and get a leg up on them. I didn't use this super often, but having yet another option for traversing the battlefield felt great. So yeah, movement and level design in this game are fantastic, but still, gunplay is Rift Apart's biggest strength, as there's seemingly a never-ending list of creative weaponry to wield and plenty of enemies to catch your bullets. You can buy new weaponry as well as upgrades and ammo for them from Miss Zircon vendors. As a quick side note, I love how she's given a real personality in Rivet's dimension, but remains a lifeless robot vendor in Ratchet's universe. Towards the end of the game, you return to Ratchet's dimension and you can find her, and I was impressed that they remembered to revert back to having the correct version of her here. It would have been easy to overlook, but they didn't, and it speaks a lot to the volumes of polish that were put onto this game. Anyway, back to guns. Gunplay in Rift Apart skews a lot in favor towards the player, but that's not really a surprise. Most weapons can't lock onto enemies, but aiming in their general direction is usually enough to land hits successfully. Many weapons will also auto-target enemies or track their movement to secure a hit, even if the player's aim isn't even close to being perfect. It gives the player a sense of control and power in combat, which greatly aids in the fun factor I described at the beginning of this video. There's also a great amount of variety within the weaponry, with some returning favorites as well as some new additions. There's different types of weaponry such as pistols, turrets, shotguns, bazookas, and more, but each of them has a creative flair to make them feel different from one another. For example, the Blast Pistol, the Lightning Strike, and the Doom Blades are all rapid-fire pistols, but they each have distinct characteristics. The Blast Pistol is a simple energy blast, which sounds basic, but it's literally the first weapon you get, so no biggie. The lightning strike shoots off electrical blasts that will chain between enemies, temporarily stunning them and doing damage. And the Doom Blades fire tiny saw blades at enemies that can ricochet multiple times to hit enemies more than once. Firing these three guns feels the same, but the visual feedback, as well as the perks that come with them, vary, which is ingenious. It's nothing new for the series, but it's good to see it continued here. All the guns just feel great to shoot, and are applicable in all situations, as no enemy is immune to any particular weapon. The biggest proof of this comes in the form of the Toxiary Sprinkler, which temporarily freezes enemies by turning them into a plant. This weapon, just like all the rest, works on every single enemy, including the final boss, which feels amazing. The game never breaks the established rule set for how weapons work just to emphasize the importance of a story-relevant boss fight. It's commendable and helps in making combat feel spectacular in this game. With that being said, I have 3 issues with the combat of Rift Apart: enemy variety, difficulty, and final weapon stages. This last point is the quickest to address, so let's do that first. Every Ratchet and Clank game I've played has used a similar approach to weapons, and Rift Apart is no different. The more you use a weapon, the more it levels up, with more upgrades to purchase. Once it reaches the max level, in this case 5, it gets a new name and a new modification that's meant to enhance the weapon for the better. Usually these level 5 transformations feel tangible, but that wasn't really the case in Rift Apart, which was disappointing. Ironically, the weapon I noticed the most change in was the starting blaster, which allows you to shoot 3 bullets at once when fully upgraded. Many of the other weapons simply add additional explosive damage when reaching their max rank, like the Apocalypse Glove or the Shatter Blast. And some weapons, like the Toxiary Sprinkler and Ricochet, didn't seem to change at all after being leveled up completely. This was disappointing, as usually maxing out a weapon meant getting some cool new modification for it, but that just wasn't the case here, at least in New Game, but this could change in New Game Plus, where weapons can reach rank 10. Anyway, I was hopeful then that maybe the upgrade trees for each weapon would provide unique modding opportunities, but sadly that wasn't the case either. I still feel compelled to level up each weapon, but it didn't ever culminate in a feeling of genuine excitement. My second issue with Rift Apart's combat is the enemy variety, which might sound a little stupid given that there are dozens and dozens of different enemies within the game. My problem is that many of them can be categorized into 3 groups that don't have a lot of variety within them. You have small enemies who pursue you and attempt to melee you, you have big enemies who attempt to melee you, and you have big enemies that try to shoot you from a distance. They all have cool designs and models, but their functionality feels pretty copy and paste. This complaint also carries over to the boss design, as far too many of them are recycled throughout the game without any variation. I would have liked to have seen more unique boss fights instead of just retreading the same ones over and over again. It really feels like they took standard enemies and slapped a health bar on them when coming up with some of these boss battles. With that being said, the point of these games has always been to empower the player, and so this simplicity in enemy design was probably intentional in order to maximize the player's sense of control. Therefore, this is the complaint that I'm willing to forgive the most. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, Rift Apart is simply too easy on the normal difficulty, and I for sure recommend playing this game on hard if you want any sort of challenge. I first realized this was an issue for me when I noticed myself taking time to break boxes and collect bolts within combat arenas before all the enemies were dead. They were so non-threatening that I knew I had time to leave them be and go harvesting for resources. Once this happened, I started reflecting more on my combat experience within Rift Apart, and I realized that I died more times to falling into voids than I did from any combat encounters. I can only remember a small handful of times in which enemies vanquished me, and this was largely due to 2 reasons. I either dispatched them so quickly using my turret weapons, plus heavy fire, or the arena was filled with enough respawning health packs that I rarely had to sweat. This changed a little bit in the game's final levels, but that was really the only point in which I felt this game challenged me in the slightest. I'm not looking for the game to go Dark Souls on me, but I would have liked to seen a little bit more challenge on the normal difficulty. Like 10% more would have went a long way. I mean, the game is fun, don't get me wrong, but don't be surprised if you catch your eyes glazing over as you just hold R2 to win every single fight if you're playing on normal. At the end of the day though, I can't really hold these minor issues against the game too much. They were things I noticed and maybe irked me a small amount, but nothing that detracted from the game. In fact, this last point can easily be alleviated by simply playing on a higher difficulty. Overall, the intended experience was for players to feel a sense of control and power as they obliterated their way through an entire universe of enemy creatures and robots, and for the most part, they succeeded immensely. It's unfortunate then that Rift Apart insists on breaking up its best gameplay with a myriad of other non-standard combat activities. Now, this is a pretty standard move for the series, and maybe I'm misremembering, but it seems like these elements pop up much more frequently than in the original trilogy. I'm talking about mechanics and systems like flying on Trudy, completing Clank puzzles, destroying viruses in glitches missions, and riding Speedles through obstacle courses. There's nothing inherently wrong with them, but in a game that's only about 10 hours to 100%, they stick out a lot. Now, to be completely honest, I don't mind 3/4 of these inclusions, but I really felt the game could have done away with the glitch missions and not much would have been lost. These missions see Ratchet using a computer program called Glitch to infiltrate infected computers and clear the viruses within them to gain access to a new area or to collect a reward. These missions are heavily focused on combat, as you'll have to shoot smaller enemy hordes and blast your way through the hives in order to complete each one. This major emphasis on combat doesn't provide a breather from gunplay like the other non-combat activities, and they also feel inferior to combat featuring Ratchet and Rivet. This is mostly because your mobility is much more limited here, meaning enemies can get on top of you faster. There's so many of these small virus enemies at some points that it feels impossible to not take heaps of damage very quickly. And because it maintains a fighting focal point, it ends up feeling out of place, and I would have preferred to see these missions cut in favor of more standard combat. Again, not a deal breaker, but it did dampen the experience a tad. To be fair though, they fully committed themselves to these missions by having 5 of them in the game, along with a short story to accompany it. The other breaks in combat are much better, especially the Clank missions, where you must solve puzzles using orbs that have various effects. I like these puzzles because the end objective is always clear, as well as what each orb is capable of doing. The goal is always to have Clank's other variations reach the endpoint of the obstacle course, but in order to do this, you have to manipulate the environment to get things lined up just right. This means using orbs that can change both the properties of the Clank clones as well as objects within the environment. For example, a heavy orb allows clones to run through heavy winds without being blown away, but it can also be used to lower platforms. With these rule sets in place, the developers were free to make some pretty clever puzzles that won't frustrate you by taking too long to solve, but also won't be such a cakewalk that you beat them within seconds. I really enjoyed these sections, and I'd put them up there as some of the best puzzles in a non-puzzle game that I've ever come across. And finally, the vehicle sections are alright as well. Speedos can be used to traverse large open areas and goo pits very quickly, but they're used a bit too often for my taste. I much prefer Trudy, a lizard dragon creature on Sargasso who can be ridden through the skies and is used sparingly to great effect. She has one optional task in the main story and one mandatory task, which felt like just the right amount for this alternate mode of play. Despite my praise for some of these sections though, I really feel the game could have used less of this content in favor of more combat sections or maybe even a few more planets to flesh out the game's length just a little bit more. Finally, our last major component of gameplay is collectibles, and going hand in hand with that is platforming. There's a handful of things to gather up in this game, including gold bolts, armor sets, Lombax lore orbs, infobots, and Kreger bears. These items are scattered throughout the levels or appear in pocket dimensions, which are essentially mini platforming challenges. Just like in Ghost of Tsushima, hunting down and nabbing these collectibles is relatively easy and won't cause you too much stress, which greatly encourages you to go after the platinum trophy. It doesn't feel like tacked on content, but it also doesn't feel like busy work that you have to slog through, which makes it very enjoyable. The greatest strength of these collectibles, though, is that each of them rewards the player with gameplay benefits and perks. For example, the armor sets each come with percentage-based upgrades such as damage reduction or experience amplifiers. On the other hand, collecting every single infobot rewards the player with the famous Rhino weapon. This all-powerful weapon rips holes in the space-time continuum, causing objects to fall through, yielding tons of explosive damage to all active enemies. But by far, the gold bolt rewards take the cake for the best reward system, as they act as gameplay and visual modifiers that can be toggled on or off. There's 25 in total to collect, and they include things like customization options for your melee weapons and ship, silly modifiers like the number of damage dealt splashing off of enemies, or the wildly beloved Big Head mode, and even extra options for the photo mode, which many players will love in a game that invites photo ops with its breathtaking visuals. And then of course there's the big guns. The last 3 gold bolts you find will give you the option to have infinite health, infinite ammo, and naturally, to turn all your weapons pure gold. I was surprised to see that all of these carry over to the game's challenge mode as well, meaning that you're able to play how you want, and that's very commendable. And not to mention, many of these collectibles are associated with Easter eggs, my favorite of which being, of course, Sly Cooper, Bentley, and the gang's van, which can all fall out of the Rhino's rifts. And as another side note, my tiny stupid brain really wants to believe that it's hinting at a new release for my favorite franchise of all time, but more than likely, it's just a wink and a nod to the generation Ratchet and Clank were born in. Still, I love to see it. Give me more Sly, give me more Cooper Gang, give me more all of it. Anyway, Rift Apart's approach to collectibles is the best I've seen in a long time, as they avoid the feeling of being a checklist of things to grab because of the great perks that they deliver to the player. Maybe I expected a bit too much, but I found the story of Rift Apart to be sort of underwhelming, given the promise of interdimensional travel and, of course, a brand new Lombax, Rivet. Before we get to that though, let me give a brief rundown of the story, and yes, this will contain full spoilers. The game opens up by introducing us to Rivet, as she pulls off a daring rescue. I'm not sure if this is meant to be a dramatic reveal, but she's been all over the promotional material, so I can't believe anyone would confuse this for Ratchet. We then cut back to the dimension we know and love, where Ratchet and Clank are being celebrated as heroes in a massive parade. The events of the day get interrupted though when Dr. Nefarious's goons show up and steal the Dimensionator away from our heroes. Nefarious's mishandling of the device rips a hole in the space-time continuum, which sucks our heroes into another universe. Before Ratchet and Clank can stop Nefarious, the Dimensionator explodes, costing Clank an arm and separating him from Ratchet. A broken Clank ends up in the hands of Rivet, while Ratchet is left on his own to track down his friend and find a way to get them home. Ratchet searches for a way to leave the planet he's on, while Rivet takes Clank to her hideout on Sargasso in order to decipher an infobot she's intercepted. At first, she is hesitant to trust Clank's wild story, but eventually realizes that he's telling the truth after viewing the robot's memories. They find a way to get in touch with Ratchet, and both parties agree to meet up after securing the necessary parts to rebuild the Dimensionator. This gives the game a good enough reason to keep the two playable characters separated, since having them both on the same planet at the same time might feel weird from a gameplay perspective. Also, I should note that it really helps that Rivet is Ratchet's dimensional counterpart, as I really couldn't see him trusting anyone else to look after his best friend, except for, well, himself, and that kinda ends up being the case here. While searching the archives, Ratchet meets Clank's dimensional counterpart, Kit, a robot who is immensely afraid of teaming up with anyone else. And it's eventually revealed that the reason this universe's Nefarious became an emperor is because Rivet and Kit never teamed up. This core friendship is what saved Ratchet and Clank's universe, but doomed things in this one. Ratchet is able to coerce Kit into joining him for the journey, and after both parties recover the necessary bits, they meet up to forge the new Dimensionator. After a somewhat awkward first encounter, Dr. Nefarious shows up and steals the newly formed weapon. This is until Rivet and Ratchet break free, with the former defeating Nefarious and seemingly have saved the day. But then of course Emperor Nefarious makes himself known as he single-handedly stops our duo and steals the Dimensionator for himself. And this kickstarts the second half of the game, where our duo look to stop the Emperor, recover the weapon, and save the universe. Ratchet and Clank are reunited, while Kit tags along with Rivet. We come to learn that the reason Kit likes to be alone is because she doesn't trust herself around other people. She was originally made by Nefarious as a soldier bot, but after injuring someone, she had an awakening and decided it was better for her to be alone. It's revealed much later that Rivet was the one that Kit hurt all those years ago when she chopped off her arm, or something like that. It's all kinda hazy. This whole side story wraps up rather quickly and is kind of underdeveloped. Basically, we learn that Kit was the one that hurt Rivet, then Rivet learns this information and is mad for a while, and they go their separate ways before Kit shows up to save the day and form the necessary connection to save this world. And it all happens very quickly and without enough information and context. The game concludes with Ratchet and Clank stopping Emperor Nefarious alongside of Rivet and Kit and enjoying a celebration of their victory. The two Lombaxes hint at venturing to the Lombax dimension that they've teased for the entire game before the credits roll and the game is over. The story is mostly here to set up the gameplay in Rift Apart, but there's enough emphasis placed on it to warrant some criticism. My issues with this narrative would be the half-baked character development, the lack of new villains to fill the sorely lacking boss encounters, and the hardcore sequel baiting upon the game's conclusion. Rivet and Kit are interesting characters that have their own personalities, but neither of them are given enough time in the spotlight to show any sort of meaningful growth or change. Rivet doesn't really change at all. She starts out the game a hero and ends the game a hero, while Kit does change, but it's done rather quickly, taking away any impact the moment might have had. Not every game needs to be The Last of Us, but given how important these characters were to the story, I wish we would have gotten more time to see them grow and to change. The problem is that Ratchet and Clank, of course, must have equal screen time, meaning the time to develop Rivet and Kit as characters is cut immediately in half just by the game existing with this premise. It's by no means a deal breaker, don't get me wrong. I just wish Kit's story arc would have had a little bit more time to marinate to make things more impactful. Her absence from the story is so short that it hardly warrants an applause or praise when she shows up to save the day. Meanwhile, Ratchet and Clank both feel sidelined throughout this story, especially Ratchet. Clank does get meaningful time with Rivet, but her and Ratchet are rarely around each other. Again, this is a necessary gameplay limitation, but it does constrain the story. And even by the end of the game, these two Lombaxes still feel like complete strangers. Rivet and Ratchet needed more time together instead of just swapping Clank and Kit like we did with Pokemon cards in grade school. Otherwise, the biggest plot threat pertaining to Ratchet would be his trepidation for venturing to the Lombax dimension. He's hesitant to use the Dimensionator at the beginning of the game after Clank gives it to him to celebrate their friendship. Then, throughout the game, he grapples with whether or not it's a place he wants to visit. After all, he's built a good life for himself, and he fears he may not stack up to the rest of the Lombax race. This uneasiness is aided by a great section on one of the planets where he recovers pieces of Lombax lore. By the end of the game though, his connection with Rivet and her excitement to meet the race changes his mind and he decides he wants to go. But then, the game just ends. We heard about this Lombax dimension for the entire game, but we never get to see it, which was kind of anticlimactic. I thought for sure we'd be able to venture there at some point, but nope, it's just saved for a sequel. It kind of reminded me of how the new God of War dangles Thor and Odin in front of you for the whole game, but then you never get to see them. It really deflated the ending of this story, especially with how little time passes from beating the Emperor to the credits rolling. And finally, I feel this game could have used a handful of minor villainous cohorts. This one's a minor gripe. It might have been asking too much since I already feel that many of the characters are underdeveloped, but at least these new minor antagonists could have made for some unique boss fights. Hell, I would have been happy with Nefarious having some sort of pet creature that we had to fight. But no, it's just robot after robot after robot. Maybe these complaints are a little too harsh, as you could certainly argue that I'm missing the point of a Ratchet and Clank story. I just want to reiterate that I understand that the plot-heavy story is meant simply to push the narrative forward and keep your guns firing throughout the gameplay. But with how much mystery and intrigue the marketing team built around Rivet leading up to the game's release, I would have liked to see more from her throughout the game. Instead, it feels like Rift Apart can't decide on being a story about Ratchet, or Rivet, or about saving the world. And so all of these elements feel underdeveloped, leading to a story that's nothing more than alright. There's a fair chance that this ends up being the most expansive and detailed presentation section of any review or critique that I've ever made, because Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is just that well done. Its art design, texture work, lighting, particle effects, draw distance, music, and more blends together perfectly, creating an enthralling experience that's gonna make your eyeballs smile. When you boot up the game, you'll be given the option to play in one of three modes. A performance mode at 60 FPS with ray tracing enabled, but reduced graphical fidelity overall. A fidelity mode that runs at 30 FPS, but has all the bells and whistles turned on to really make the game pop. And also another 60 FPS mode that also disables ray tracing for a better picture quality. I decided to play the game at 60 FPS with ray tracing on after trying out the 30 FPS mode and realizing how much the PS5 has molded my expectations towards higher frame rates. It's true, once you go 60 FPS or higher, it's very hard to go back. There are many elements of the presentation that will wow you while playing through Rift Apart. In the opening parade segment, I feared that this was Insomniac boosting the visuals to the max to give a good first impression, and that the rest of the game wouldn't live up to it. I'm glad to say I was completely wrong, as this level of graphical output is consistent throughout. For me, one thing that immediately stood out is the gorgeous and seemingly never-ending backdrops that are anchored by expansive worlds for you to explore. Landing on new planets for the first time was exhilarating, because you were always welcomed in with a breathtaking shot of the world you'd be exploring next. These quick and quiet moments of beauty provided a temporary but quaint change of pace from the barrage of bullets, turrets, lasers, and missiles that normally took up the screen. And speaking of gunplay, what really surprised me is that despite how many enemies and projectiles can be seen on the screen at once, this visual quality never really dips. It sometimes feels like the game is right on the verge of having too much on the screen at once, which would restrain the player's view. But for me, it never crossed into that undesirable territory. Seeing this much action and particle effects on screen at the same time began to convince me that this game was truly built for the next generation and just wouldn't function properly on a PS4. But what really took the cake in this regard was the level warping transitions that occur when moving into pocket dimensions, or even more impressively, loading in an entire world instantly. Throughout the levels, the player can stumble into these pocket dimensions that are much different looking than the planets you've been exploring. You have to open these rifts using an animation, which may hide the 1 second of load time the game needs to bring this up. Regardless, it was still pretty impressive. It wasn't until I reached the planet of Blizzard Prime though, and struck one of these phase quartz, that my jaw truly dropped. There's 2 levels in the game that feature this mechanic. You strike the quartz, and the level alternates between a pristine and destroyed form. Progressing through the level requires you to jump back and forth between these dimensions, and it's used in clever ways mechanically. But from a technical standpoint, it was awesome to see these worlds change on the fly. It felt a lot like that one Titanfall 2 mission, except taken to the next level with better graphics and texture work overall. The lighting was also phenomenal throughout the game, as I took a lot of moments to just soak it all in. Take this shot here for instance, where Ratchet's backside is glowing from a nearby green light, but his front side isn't affected. There's plenty of awesome lighting like this throughout the game. I should also mention that if you notice one of these cool visual treats, and to be honest, how could you not, you can also use the game's photo mode to capture them forever. Another nod needs to be given to the texture work that is unbelievably high resolution. A lot has been made of Ratchet's fur being rendered strand by strand for good reason, as it looks incredible. Clank also has that glossy metallic look that you'd expect from a robot. YouTube's compression paired with my inability to record in 4K will not do this game justice, but my god, it is incredibly beautiful from top to bottom. And there's also a healthy dose of variety in the worlds you visit. It would have been very easy to retread the same biomes we've seen time and time again, but instead, enough variety and themes were introduced to make sure that no planet feels the same as any other. You have the asteroid fields and heavy mining influence of Blizzard Prime. Then there's Ardolis, a planet consisting of mostly water that's home to pirates. And then of course there's also Zordoom, the prison planet where Emperor Nefarious keeps his victims and enemies. These are just a few of the creative planets you'll traverse in Rift Apart. The music of Rift Apart didn't necessarily wow me, but it served as a perfect reflection to the action on screen most of the time, which is all I really needed it to be. If I had to pick some favorites, I'd say I really enjoyed the main menu theme, Ye Ardolis, and Culmination at Corson 5. It's not a soundtrack I'd listen to outside of the game, but it fit perfectly in most instances. And I'd also like to give a shout out to the game for how it uses the DualSense to its advantage. Any option that you're not a fan of can be turned off in the menu system, but the adaptive triggers and vibrational feedback were used wonderfully throughout this game. Many of the guns in the game control differently depending on whether or not you hold the triggers halfway down or all the way down. This usually relates to how guns are aimed, but in a couple instances, it can be used to charge up your shots. The controller's ability to use sound was also well done. Whew, that was a lot of praise for this game's presentation, and it's deservedly so. And really, the only complaint I can muster would be a few instances in which Ratchet and Rivet interacted strangely with the environment. There were a few spots where I'd attempt to jump onto something, but the game determined I was out of bounds and would respawn me. It happened enough times to make note of it, but it never became that much of an issue. I've also seen some folks complain that objects in the environment don't react to Ratchet when you're walking into them or on them, and that's true, but again, it's not a deal breaker. Most of the time, you'll be too busy shooting stuff to care about these minor complaints. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is the first game I can confidently say is a must-play for owners of the PlayStation 5. For as much as I love the Demon's Souls remake, I can acknowledge that it's a game that's not for everyone. Rift Apart, on the other hand, seems like an experience that a large portion of gamers will enjoy. The combat is fast, fluid, hectic, and makes you feel heroic. The impressive roster of creative weapons will ensure that you hold that R2 trigger down as often as possible to level up those guns quickly. I wish these weapons would have been a little bit more transformative upon reaching their final stage, but it is what it is. And again, they could change at level 10 in New Game Plus, so I can't complain too much there either. Overall, combat is explosive and entertaining. I just wish it wasn't interrupted as much as it is. But when it does become time to holster the guns for a bit, there's plenty of other decent tasks to complete. The story could have used a little bit more time to develop the characters, but it serves its main role of setting up the gameplay just fine. And as you've seen throughout this video, the game is drop dead gorgeous, and we'll see you taking many breaks throughout just to absorb all the vistas and views. Do yourself a favor if you have a PlayStation 5 and go out and buy Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. It pushes the medium forward technically, while also providing some of the most pure, fun gameplay that I've experienced this year. It's a game you won't want to miss, and it's sure to add another platinum trophy to your collection by the time the dust settles. Hey guys, thanks for checking out my review of Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. The video came together a little later than I had hoped, but I'm glad to have the finished product out now. If you enjoyed this video, check out some of my other lengthy reviews on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, or even a dislike. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter @NopeNapNarp. And as always guys, have a nice day, and take care.